So as you can probably notice, I'm a non-native speaker of English. My home country is Chile and my native language is Spanish. So yeah, we decided to run this workshop about some problems that we face when we are writing most of our text, I think, in English nowadays, and a few tips on how to solve them. Well, this come mostly from personal experience. I guess maybe in some cases you may feel like this applied to you, maybe some problems you haven't faced them, but I hope that overall you will get some useful tips from this session. Well, this workshop, we structure it in 3 parts. So first we will mention a few bits about some things that are mostly related to when we are just starting the first draft, what things to do, what we shouldn't do. Then we will focus on some things that are mostly happen during the main writing stage, some key decisions that we need to take, and also a few tips not specifically related to writing, but how to focus. And then we will move to the final part, which is about polishing the text, and basically what we can do before we book a consultation with the Academic Writing Center in order to make this consultation more productive for us. Of course, there are some bits that will overlap, between the first draft on the main stage, or some things that I will mention in the main writing stage, but also may apply for the polishing part. So these 3 sections are not totally independent one from each other. So just keep that in mind. Let's start on how to start. I think, well, this is a problem that I faced when I was starting my PhD, and when I was trying to write the first draft of my first chapter, is that I was trying to get the perfect sentence, and sometimes I was struggling to write 1 or 2 sentences in a whole day because I was really unhappy with the results. Or sometimes I would write 2 sentences and then I would delete 3. So you can imagine that the progress in this way was quite slow. And then a friend of mine told me okay, try not to aim for perfection, just start writing something, and then you will have time to improve it later. And I think that was a very good advice from him. Also, as my mom says, well, and then I started Googling this quote, and I realized that Voltaire said it a few centuries before my mom, but she, at least this is something I heard from my mom first, that is perfect is the enemy of good. Sometimes we have something that is good enough in terms of text or in other situations in life. And when we try to move from this good enough to perfect, then sometimes we make a mess. So and I think especially in the first draft, we shouldn't try to aim for perfection. Please do not take this as just kind of advice just to be mediocre. This is mostly about the first stages. Of course, when you want to submit an excellent text without any mistakes and of high quality. But when we are just starting to write, especially in a language that is not ours, then I think that to get us start is more important than aiming for perfection from the very beginning. And anyway, you will spend plenty of time polishing a text and rewriting a paper. So you will still devote a lot of time for polishing, but this comes later. Some strategies that can help, and well, these many things that I will say today may vary by discipline, also may vary by personal preferences. So of course, this workshop is not intended that you should follow every single thing of what I'm saying here. But I mean, I hope that at least, I mean, I guess some things are more kind of general, or some things are more applied to most of us. There are some things that are very specific by discipline. So, well, at least in my personal case, I think it's always useful to have at least a basic idea of the structure of the paper. Well, I will talk a bit more about this later. In some journals, there are some very specific requirements about the structure and some not, but overall, I think it's useful to have at least a basic outline of how the paper is going to look, and then we can start like writing like sections. Depending on the discipline, sometimes the introduction is like one of the sections that we write at the very end. And because at least in economics, which is my field, in most like of the topical economic journals nowadays, they want that the idea is that if you read the introduction, then you should be able to understand the whole paper. So in the introduction, you should like see the results, the main methods, also like an overview of the literature, your contribution, and the implications. Therefore, of course, you need to have all this information before writing the introduction. Therefore, like in economics, normally we focus first on the body of the paper, so the data, the empirical strategy, the results. And then once we have the core of the paper, then we start writing the introduction. Again, like this may vary by discipline, but just keep in mind that even if you have the basic structure of the paper, it doesn't mean necessarily that you will write these structures in order. And also I think one important thing, especially when we are just starting our careers, is to read like papers from good journals for two reasons. Like first, to get ideas, of course, but also to pick up language. And well, for the second bit, it doesn't necessarily have to be like very specific journals from our disciplines, like also like some more generic newspapers like The Economist. Like they have a very good writing level, so that also can help you to grasp the language. What else? Yeah, one thing I would like to emphasize, and well, I hope this is not the case with you, but this is something I've seen many times, is that, and especially with like people at the early stages of their research path, is that sometimes people say, okay, like I prefer to start writing in my native language, and then I will translate to English, which is something I would definitely encourage everyone to avoid. First, because it's very time consuming. Like maybe like you think that, okay, in Russian or in your native language, you can write faster. But then I'm pretty sure that translating to English will be more time consuming. And that's not the only problem. Also, like, I assume that most of us, we are not like professional translators or interpreters. Therefore, like, I think we may have a tendency, and this is something I have seen, that we start like writing kind of a word by word translation, which sounds very unnatural. And well, even I remember like, a few years ago, like an uncle like bought a digital piano, and the manual was in English, and he asked me to translate it into Spanish. So yeah, I started translating it to Spanish, but then like when I was reading like at least the first version of the translation, like even though I was writing in my native language, then like I could see that the structure was a bit weird, and it was clear that it was not something I had written in the first place in Spanish. And I think that problems gets much worse when we translate from our native language to the non-native language, like English in this case. Also, like I remember like a friend of mine who was doing a master's recently, and he sent me his thesis twice for me to have a look and to help him with like the writing and with some ideas. And some sections at the very end that were like the sections that he hadn't finished yet, there were like many bits written in Spanish. And then when I read those sections again, like in almost the final version of the thesis, I could realize that, yeah, like there were like many sections, especially at the end, that reading the text sounded really unnatural. And it's because, and I could tell that he was making some word by word translation from Spanish to English. And then this sounds quite weird. So this is something I would definitely encourage you to avoid. And I would emphasize again that it's something really time consuming. So I would say that this is a big no. So now we'll start talking about the main writing stage. So, well, these decisions, again, in some cases, some of these decisions are, in some cases, very important to make before we start writing the main, like the paper. in some cases, they are not so important. So it's, I think it may depend, like on the field, it may depend on whether you have a very specific journal in mind or not. So for example, if you have like a very clear idea of the journal that you want to submit your paper, then I think it's totally worth to go to the journal, see the guidelines, and see whether they have a specific requirement about, for example, British versus American English, which is something I will discuss a bit more later. Also, well, and this I think applies. So British versus American English, yeah, there are some journals that have specific requirements. So if you have a very specific journal in mind, go and check. About the structure, then like some journals, they have some specific structure, even some conferences, when you send like an extended abstract or a short paper, also they are rigid about the structure. For example, like I mentioned before, like when in econ, like in at least in most of the top journals, like in the introduction, you should like put kind of all the main information of the paper, including like a sort of literature review. But it happened to me once. I was submitting to another journal, and they asked specifically, please do not include the literature in the introduction, add a separate section of the literature review. So yeah, like, and these decisions, of course, are important. So I think in some cases it's you should like have a look for the definite structure. In other cases, the structure can be more flexible. Same with referencing. I think well, there are like some standard referencing, and I don't think that's a big deal, but still, like it's better to have a look before, and then like use the format of at least the first journal that you are thinking about. A bit more about referencing. Please use a reference manager. I think it's also quite time consuming to put the references by hand. Even if it, and also like you can make some mistakes. So I would say this is quite worth to do, and you have plenty to choose. Well, I know from some friends that they use either Mendeley or Sotero. In my case, since I write in LaTeX, I use BibTeX, which is like the associated library. But and you have others, even like I think Word also has like an option to add bibliography. So yeah, you have plenty of options, but I would say do it and don't leave it for later, because then like if we haven't done it and we need to start like adding all the references by hand, then also this will be a bit time consuming. Going back to the requirements of journals, like some journals will have some specific requirements. Some others, they don't. They just said like, it doesn't matter if you write in British or American English, just try to be consistent with what you're using. And yeah, if there's no specific requirement, or if at this stage you don't know for sure to which journal you're submitting, which is totally reasonable, then just choose the one you feel more comfortable with. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's British or American English, just try to be consistent. Of course, if you had the chance of having a consultation with Pete from the Academic Writing Center, then he would disagree with that statement. He will tell you like you should go for British English, that's the only English. But besides that, like just choose the one you're more comfortable and be consistent. That's I think that's the takeaway message, like be consistent. A bit on how to focus. So this is not directly related to writing, but I think it can be the case that if you're not writing in our native language, then we may struggle a bit more to focus. I think that sometimes less is more. So, well, this is a picture of myself working in Yekaterinsky Park, which is quite close to where I live. And yeah, like especially when I'm writing, and even more like when I'm polishing my text, like it's really helpful for me not to have Wi-Fi. Otherwise, yeah, I'm paying attention to emails, and otherwise you have always the temptation of checking YouTube or Instagram or newspapers or whatever. So I think, yeah, sometimes it's quite useful not to have internet. Also, for example, in my desk, besides my laptop, I have 2 additional screens. which for data analysis is really helpful, but for writing not so much, because it's basically I have two more screens where I can get distracted. So yeah, like sometimes if I have the opportunity, and if I'm not waiting for any urgent email or something, then I try to disconnect from internet at least one afternoon or half a day per week if possible. Another thing that has helped me, well, in the past and nowadays, is what's called the Pomodoro technique. So from those who have not heard about it, the idea is that you will have several cycles of 25 minutes of working plus 5 minutes of rest, and then another 25 minutes of working and a 5 minutes break. The standard method considers 4 cycles, so in total 2 hours. So, and for example, when I was doing my PhD in Nottingham, there was a workshop called Shut Up and Write. And yeah, like they would take a few of us, like from all like doing postgraduate in research, and there would be like a moderator whose only task was basically like to keep the timer. And yeah, like once there were like 25 minutes running out, then like the person would tell us, okay, like you have a 5 minutes break, you can have a coffee, a chat, whatever. And then like we would, after those 5 minutes, we would sit down for another 25 minutes, and this process for 2 hours. I even some days I use it now. And in YouTube, you can, if you type like Pomodoro timer, then you will have plenty of options, even some that they will make some sound or some ring when is the transition from a break to working, or from working to a break. And yeah, also I've seen some options like not only of 25 plus 5, but also like some of 20 plus 10. And well, you have the standard of 2 hours, so 4 cycles. You have some others of 8 cycles for 4 hours, or even a whole working day, 8 hours. So you have different options. So yeah, if you haven't tried, then maybe you want to have a look. Yeah, indeed. I mean, of course, like there are some tasks that we need more than 25 minutes to be focused in a row, but I think occasionally this can help us to have 25 minutes to be really focused, instead of like spend an hour in which like, yeah, like we spend some time writing, but then we start checking our emails, or oh, I wanted to check something in another website. So yeah, like if I think we all have those days in which we are struggling to focus, I would say this is something worth to try. So going back to writing itself, the sentence structure. So yeah, I mentioned before, like this is quite problematic when we translate from our native language to English. But even if we write directly in English, then sometimes we may use the structure of our native language. And I remember, like, again, when I was doing the PhD, so my main supervisor, he's Italian, and Italian and Spanish are like languages that are quite close. They both share the Latin roots, and they both share like similar grammar, similar vocabulary. And yeah, like a few times, especially in the earlier draft, then my supervisor would read something and would tell me, okay, this was clearly something that you were thinking in English and just writing it in, sorry, you were thinking in Spanish and writing it in English. So yeah, like sometimes we may end up writing like Master Yoda. Of course, if you submit your paper and the referee is a fan of Star Wars, then maybe he or she will appreciate that you write like Master Yoda, but most likely you will need to change that. So some cases Google can help. So like there are some sentences that if I'm not sure of the structure, if I'm not sure if I should include or not an article, I try to Google the sentence, and then sometimes I see that there are like other papers that use the same sentence, and then it's fine, or otherwise I see, okay, like I cannot find anything good from it, so I should change it. So yeah, like I think Google in some cases can help. Also, there are like some other online tools that can help you with this. And I know that, yeah, like my Russian is very limited, but I know that Russian is I think, more flexible than English in that sense of the structure. So yeah, this is something we should keep in mind when we are writing. And again, like, it helps to read some good journals from our field or some newspapers like The Economist. Another important issue is active versus passive voice. And again, like, well, economists, we love to, when we receive a question, we love to answer by saying, like, it depends. So we're quite bad at replying yes or no. We always start saying, oh, well, actually it depends. And then we start making the argument. So yeah, what should you use, active or passive voice? Then yeah, it depends. And yeah, it depends on the discipline. In many disciplines, the passive voice is considered like more formal. In others, it's not very well regarded. And yeah, for some reason that I'm not sure, economists, for example, they prefer the active voice. And yeah, I've read like a few manuals on, like, or guides on how to write for economists. And yeah, like, probably, I don't know if there's any economists in the room, but if not, I guess at least you are kind of aware that we tend to disagree about everything. Well, I'm taking a quote, well, it wasn't about economists, but it was from a TV series. I would say if you get like 10 economists in a room, I'm pretty sure that they will not agree on the color of an orange, but they do agree that active voice is preferable. So yeah, like, keep it in mind, and this goes back to consistency. So like, have a look to what is better or what is more widely used in your discipline and try to be consistent with this. The activity, we have 4 sentences in the handout. Some of them are written in active voice, so please rewrite them in passive voice. Those which are in passive voice, rewrite them in the active voice. I will share what I have, and then we will discuss a bit the differences from what answers I have received so far. So the first one is like, we spent several days cleaning the data set. And yeah, what I have is several days were spent cleaning the data set. There was one option that said like several days were spent by us cleaning the data set. Another option, like, the data set was cleared in several days. So both variations are okay. In this case, we may or may not include the subject. So this is up to you. In this case, I decided to leave the subject away. So here I was focusing on what was the action performed rather than who performed the action. But yeah, like, if in some cases you may want to specify who was doing what. The second one is, a mistake was made. Since we don't know who made a mistake, then we have different options. In my case, I put I made a mistake. And the answers in the chat, I saw like we made a mistake. Yeah, actually we had like, well, I had this workshop yesterday and we had a bit of a discussion on like which one option was better. I think like this is highly dependent on the context and also like cultural differences. For example, like if we were in the UK, then probably the best way to say this, a mistake was made and yeah, no one is blamed, and yeah, like we don't point the finger to anyone. I think in other, I don't know, in other contexts, when like there is some collective responsibility, then even if the person who is communicating this didn't make the mistake, then in some cases it's better to say like, we made a mistake instead of he or she made a mistake. Well, if you were working on your own, then yeah, like, I mean, at least personally, I don't mind saying, okay, I made a mistake. But yeah, I think this depends on the context. And yeah, we have another option now in the chat. So the dataset had been cleaned during several days, and yes, these are other variations. So the third one, which is the Academic Writing Center gave me this template. Yeah, I put like this template was given to me And then like optional, you can put or not by the Academic Writing Center. Like, so that's what they put it in parentheses. And I think this more or less agrees with what I saw in the chat. And finally, the information was sent to your email. And yeah, we don't know the subject. So I decided to put like, she sent you the information to your email, but yeah, you can say she or he, we, I. So this is quite flexible. So yeah, I think that overall the answers in the chat, well, they grasp the main idea. Well, some minor comments that I sent privately, but I think overall, like the idea was is clear. So yeah, so once more, like this varies by discipline, but remember to be consistent. And yeah, now let's move to the final stage of writing, which is polishing. So yeah, we have a full draft, but of course this is only like the first version and it's not a polished one. And yeah, here I will go against of what I said at the beginning. At the beginning, I said like, please do not translate directly from your native language to English. And this is exactly what I'm doing right now. So as the saying goes, it's like, do as I say, don't do as I do. We have an expression when something is like not so, something is not very polished. We said, okay, this was carved with an axe only. Like, of course, if you're carving something with an axe, it will not be very refined. It will not be a very polished thing. Same with drafts. So it's time now to use the rasp on some paper to make it better. But of course, we need the basic structure first in order to start polishing. So what are my recommendations? So I would say polish your text, polish it again, then book a consultation with the Academic Writing Center, and then submit to the journal that you are targeting. And why we want to polish our text? Because you think, okay, if we have this wonderful people from the Academic Writing Center, why shouldn't we go straight away to them? Well, there are several reasons, but so I would say that it's important that we do some polishing on our own in order to have a more productive session. So keep in mind that you can at most book 3 hours per month. That's my understanding of the limit. And if you have like a really long text, then if you want to go really into detail, then maybe this 3 hours will not be enough. Also, like, well, there's like a limited capacity of the center. Like there are like some periods in which it's really hard to book a slot, at least, especially when you have like a favorite consultant. So yeah, like I think that's important to consider that this is a limited resource, and therefore we want to have a very productive session with them. So what things that we should do on our own in order to have this productive session is first, like, check for basic spelling and grammar mistakes. And you can use a spell checker, like you have options in Google, in Google Docs if you use that, or in Word it comes one. In later you can install one. So there are like some options to at least check the basic typos. I will mention like a bit more about this later, but at least try to check like the most obvious typos. And well, be ready to discuss logical development of ideas in order to make your text better. So I think that if your text is mostly without typos, then you can spend some time like in how to develop ideas. And this is something that it has happened to me many times in the consultations, or like sometimes like I spend some time polishing, but there are like some bits that I really like cannot get through on how to write them in a way that I'm satisfied. So I can say to Pete or to the consultant, oh, like, you know, like, please help me like with this section, because actually I didn't manage to do it. Or even if I don't tell to him, then he will say, oh, like, by the way, this is the text is kind of okay, but this section is weird. Which was also the case with this very slide. This was like when I was working on the workshop, on the first version of the slide, I was not very satisfied. And well, I sent it to the people from the center. Then we had a meeting, and yeah, we spent some time discussing this slide that was clearly not well developed at the beginning. But it was like one slide. It was not that we had to spend 2 hours revising the whole workshop. So the same applies for the consultations. And yeah, I think that if you didn't check the journal guidelines before, then this is the time to do it. Because yeah, like you need to know whether there are some specific requirements about the journal that you are planning to submit. So yeah, of course, by this stage, you should like know to which journal you're submitting your paper first. And for more information, then you can go to the link. I understand that, well, before the end of the session, Natalia will send you the feedback form, and then after that, you will receive the slides. So then like, you have more information on how to book a consultation and some other tips that you can check in the link later. As I said, like spell checkers can help, but they're not perfect, as you can see in this photo. And well, also I will give you like a real life example from myself. So if I'm writing in a rush or if I'm not 100% focused, then for example, I tend to mix a lot, actually more than I would like to acknowledge, like where of location with where of verb to be, and this of like singular and plural usages. So like there are no typos here. All these words are written correctly, but a spell checker may not pick up these mistakes. So don't think that only because, for example, if you're using Word, it's not highlighting you a sentence, then don't think that it's perfect. There are some mistakes that the spell checker will not catch. So how should we do it to polish it on our own? And well, this is something that, well, to be honest, I learned like while using the consultations from the Academic Writing Center. So one important thing that you will have to do it in the consultations is that you must read the text loudly. I understand that these are the guidelines of the consultation. So like regardless of who you are working with, you should be asked to do this. From personal experience, I know that some consultants are a bit more flexible about this than others. And yeah, like it can be very tempting, especially when you're really desperate to submit something. It can be very tempting just to send the text to the consultant and just ask him to rewrite whatever he thinks that is better. But like in order to make the best of the consultation, and especially for helping us to learn, to read out loud is really, really important. It will help us to go slower, and it will help us to spot more mistakes than if we're just like kind of reading in a quick way. However, this is not foolproof, at least not for me. Like when this is something that happened to me a few times. I don't know if you have had the same, but and yeah, I've been many times working with Pete, and yeah, I'm reading the text out loud. And sometimes there is a mistake in the text, which I fix it automatically in my mind. So what I say is like the correct sentence, but the mistake stays in the text. And yeah, he says, oh, by the way, like what you said is correct, but there is a mistake in the text. So please read again. And yeah, then I see that there's like an article missing, or I don't know, some error. So yeah, like be careful. But certainly, like when you read out loud, you or you find many more mistakes when you don't do this. Also, it happens to me nowadays when I'm working with Pete that when I start like reading the paper, like even like before he points to some mistake, I find them on my own just by reading it out loud, which is something I try to do more on my own, but I know that sometimes we have the incentive of just trying to read as fast as possible. So keep this in mind. Can anyone tell me what is the mistake in the picture? This is in, well, for those who are not familiar, this is in London, in the United Kingdom. we see the Big Ben, one of these traditional two-decker buses, also like these traditional black cabs. Well, yeah, so it's about the driver, and basically, well, I guess most of us know, but in the UK, they don't drive like in Russia, they drive on the left lane, and in the picture, they are driving in the right lane. So they're like, the bus should be coming on the left, and the taxi should be going out on the right. They drive in the left lane, and again, like the driver should be at the other side. So, well, now let's go to the task itself. Task 2 is about polishing. I have 3 sentences there. So, well, in the first sentence, I didn't put like any, let's say, obvious mistakes. So, well, here I wrote it in active voice, but we can rewrite this as in passive voice, as we shared, like an increasing gap can be seen, or there's an increasing gap. So yeah, this is more about polishing, basically to say an increasing gap between the health of people who have higher education compared to that of those who do not. I think that these are kind of debatable issues. You may decide for one or the other. Also, for example, like another person in the other workshop said, like we should like include the article like the health of the people who have higher education. In the article, in this particular case, it's not necessary, although you may use it. So yeah, in the first sentence, yeah, I agree that there are like different ways to write it, but in terms of kind of basic obvious mistakes, I believe that there are no such mistakes. But yeah, writing is not hard science, so yeah, we even if we, let's say, if we give this sentence to 3 different professional English speakers, then you may receive 3 different variations with like some slight differences. Then in the second sentence, yeah, like technically speaking, data is a plural word, so we should talk about the data are. However, like, well, I think in many cases you will say that you will see that the data is, and like, I don't think that today like anyone will chop off your head by stating the data is, but technically speaking, data is a plural word, so we should use data are. And in the third sentence, yeah, there were 2 things. So first, like this is the singular use with graphs, which is a plural word. So it should be this and graphs. And yeah, I put the word complement here, which it sounds and it's written very similar to the word complement, but this means 2 completely different things. Like my ideas here was to say that the graphs and the numerical findings like go in the same direction and they complement to each other. A compliment is to say, oh, like you're someone very smart or you're very pretty. So yeah, like compliment here is not a typo, but of course it's not, from the context, you can see that it's not the appropriate word. So compliment, for example, is, I think it's quite unlikely that the basic spell checker will detect it. This and yeah, this graph probably like it will be detected, but the complement probably not. So yeah, keep in mind that spell checkers can help us, but also they have some limitations. So yeah, now to the final part of the workshop. So as I mentioned at the beginning, like we can choose writing in British English or American English, which they have several spelling differences. Some of them are more structural, like the ones that I'm mentioning here. For example, single versus double L, like in British English, normally they use double L, and in American English, like single L, like in canceling, traveling, or other words. Then the OU versus O, like color with or without the U. So the first variant is British English, the second one is American. Then S versus Z, like in the word organizing. And this is something I learned recently, to be honest. About quotation marks, like single versus double quotation marks, you can see more examples in the link that I have attached here. But yeah, like these are kind of structural differences also that you should try to be consistent in your text. And now we can move to the third activity. So I planned 7 minutes for it, but if you finish early, we can start having a look at it early. If you look in the handout again, I have 3 columns of a table. The first column has pairs of words. So for example, biscuits and cookies, and word with one or double L, truck and lorry, and so on. And the idea is to put them in the so to check which variation is British, which variation is American. So I think the most tricky one here is enroll, because actually it goes with what I mentioned before, that normally in British English, double L is most used, and in American English, one L, but with this word is the other way around. And actually, this is a word that honestly, like, I mean, I don't use it very often, but every time I use it, or almost every time I use it, I double check, because I'm always a bit confused about this one. So this was a bit tricky. And I think most of the others, they were fine. And well, like, I guess if you're in London, you will talk more about the tube than the underground. But yeah, the formal word is underground. Yeah, I think that, well, the most academic ones here are, I would say, math with S versus math without S. Well, the ground floor and first floor, I think still that could be a bit debatable. But yeah, like just careful that, as usual, and well, as in the Russian language and in the Spanish language, there are many exceptions. I think here there are not that many exceptions, but enroll is one of them. So be careful with this if you face it. Of course, like this is not like such a big deal, but as I said, like try to aim for consistency. That's the important thing. I would like you to remember the following. So this would be like my takeaway from so what we have covered so far. So yeah, avoid writing in Spanish first, sorry, in Russian first in your case, or in your native language. Try to write directly into English. Do not aim for perfection in the first draft, because otherwise this can take quite a lot of time. I think it's better to start writing first and then to worry about polishing. We should try to polish the text on our own before we book a consultation with the Academic Writing Center, and well, this will make the time more productive, and I think that a better outcome will come compared to just coming with the first draft to them, in which you need to spend a lot of time just checking some typos or some basic stuff. And don't forget to read out loud. I know that this can be uncomfortable, but this is very, very important. Also because when you're reading out loud, then you have a better idea of how you want the sentence to sound, and this can help you also with punctuation. So please do not. So please don't get pissed at the consultants when they ask you to read out loud if you haven't faced it yet. It's really. Yeah, it can be annoying at the beginning, but it's really helpful. So yes, this is my message.